Okay, welcome back to our Module 3 on organizational communication, and this is the second lecture. And what we'll be looking at are the three approaches to organizational communication. And maybe you're watching the lectures back to back, so you don't need this, but just brief review. Talked about the communication model and the basics of that. Doesn't really work. The basic communication model is helpful for a frame of reference, but doesn't help super well with organizational communication. Talked about the iceberg, right? And keep that in mind as we move through this whole course. The iceberg is a great metaphor to think about organizations as a whole and organizational communication. What's really going on below the surface, right? And digging into that to truly understand. Gave you three definitions of OrgComm. None of those, again, the last slide that we looked at was the problem with that is all three of them leave out the constitutive aspect of communication in an organization, right? And that's that idea of we through our human communication form the organization and help create it. And we'll get more into that with one of these perspectives here in a minute. So we're going to go on and talk about the three theoretical perspectives of organizational communication. And I present these from the standpoint of pretty much if you were to go take a course on organizational communication, you're going to be exposed to these three perspectives. Or if you've got a book on organizational communication, you're going to be reading about, as in like a textbook, you're going to be reading about these three perspectives. So these are kind of the three main ones, the three big ones. And depending on the professor or the consultant, they're going to have one of these perspectives. And each of them kind of has, they'll rise a little bit more, or depending on what you're doing, it may be a little bit more of a focus. So we'll talk about each of them in turn. And I'm going to give you like 30,000 foot view of these. So if any of them like really intrigue you, you might want to do more reading on them. But the reality is, like, in OrgComm, when I taught the course on that, we spent a whole semester just digging into these three perspectives. We did the basics of what is OrgComm, and then pretty much the whole semester was digging into these three perspectives and how are they applied, and doing case studies and how would an individual look at them, right? So there's a lot more to these than what I'm going to give you here, but you'll get the idea. You'll understand them, hopefully, when I'm done with this. So they're the traditional perspective, the interpretive perspective, and the critical perspective. We'll walk through each one. So if you look at that slide there for the traditional perspective, what you see there is some bullet points to describe, and I'll kind of walk through those. But I would just say, kind of jump into that second one, the traditional approach is very closely connected to classical management. And so from our previous lectures, right, that idea of, fail and Frederick Winslow Taylor and the others, Weber and bureaucracy and all of that kind of structure that went with that. The traditional approach of OrgComm will closely adhere to classical management. So that's why I put that first kind of bullet point there. As I said, think org charts, think organizational charts. Now, by the way, I like organizational charts. They're helpful. I'm not knocking on them. It's just that idea that it's very structured and it's very clear who's in charge and where's our next layer and things like that, right? So that's, and almost from the standpoint of when we create the organization, one of the first steps is we want to create an org chart, right? Just to help us understand relationships and reporting relationships and everything else. Again, I like them, not knocking on org charts, just giving a perspective there. But the idea in a traditional approach to OrgComm is the information flows from the top down. Now, I'm speaking in generalities, right? So understand when I say that, I'm not trying to indicate that like never do they seek employee feedback. But the idea would be this: the upper leadership as a whole, the upper leadership decides we need feedback, survey, right? And then they take the feedback, look at it and go, okay, does this fit the narrative? Do we agree with this or not? And it may be, oh, that's interesting and helpful, and so we do something with it. But the feedback doesn't necessarily change things in the organization or if it does, it's a very controlled kind of change. And I hope I'm being clear with this. This is where the video lectures fall short. So this might be something, if you want to ask a question in the discussions to clarify that, please do. But again, I'm not trying to indicate that a traditional structure never seeks feedback. It's just they're going to be pretty careful, controlled with their feedback. And so again, the control of the information is top down. It's going to flow from the top down. And when they seek feedback, even that flows from the top down, if you know what I mean. So again, think hierarchy, right? That's a traditional org chart, things like that. And then with this, the organizational culture is decided by the management, upper management, and the structures of the organization support that organizational culture. So an example I would give would be this, not trying to indicate that people don't have input, but the idea would be this. Upper management says, this is the kind of culture that we want, and so here's how we're going to go about putting the structure into place. So for example, what metaphor does the organization want to use? I'll give you Disney as an example, right? If you go to Disney, guests to the park or visitors to the park aren't visitors, they're not customers, they're guests. Employees aren't team members, they're not crew members, they're cast members, right? Everything's about the show. And so for Disney, they've decided that's that metaphor that they want to use. So we have guests and we have cast members. And that was a decision by upper management that is then forced down. Now, does it create a culture for the customer experience or the guest experience? Sure, it does. And that's why, Disney's often looked at as creating this culture. But that wasn't the employees got together one day and said, we want to really treat people when they come to the parks like they're our guests. Let's call them guests. That was an upper management decision that is then forced down, and it's reinforced through training, as employee onboarding and the training and everything else. Or think Chick-fil-A, right? Chick-fil-A, what do they say? You give your order, they give you your food, you say thank you, they say my pleasure. That is a corporate decision from Atlanta, Georgia, that they reinforce in all of their stores, right? So again, that's not a natural springing up from the employee thing. That is a corporate culture from the top down. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm not trying to indicate it is at all. I'm just saying that's the traditional approach. We decide what we want for the culture, and then we reinforce it through our structures going down. So that's the traditional approach. Then you have the interpretive approach. Carl Weick is a name that, if you haven't already, you'll see this. I'm going to have you read an article. Part of Module 3 is reading an article that he wrote about smoke jumpers who died tragically. I don't want to say any more about that. You'll get to that here in Module 3. But Carl Weick was instrumental in the interpretive approach. And this really kind of connects with that human interaction view. And it's the idea of this. We, the members of the organization, create the culture. We change the culture. We influence all these things through our communication, our relationships with one another. So that's why it's strongly connected with the human interaction view. And I mentioned in the last lecture how things have changed since COVID. The example I gave in the old lectures about this is it was kind of interesting to me when I went back and listened, because pre-COVID, we didn't even know about COVID. It was a couple years before that. And I said, imagine if tomorrow Clarkson College had to shut down. We couldn't come to the building anymore. And we would realize Clarkson College isn't our building. It's the people that make it up. Well, that is exactly what we had happen in March of 2020, right? All of a sudden, organizations all across the country, all across the world, had to recognize, whoa, wait a minute, we are not our brick and mortar building. Now, some had already shifted to that, right? We were already moving along that line, but that forced a lot of organizations full force into recognizing our organizations are our people. They're not necessarily our structures. And of course, then there's a whole nother thing we could talk about regarding how to schools and companies and organizations adapt and change with COVID. Did they, were they able to, right? That gets into more information down the road, but I just use that as the example. We were confronted in a way with the human interaction view, because the human interaction to a large extent was taken away. And then we had to find new ways of interacting as people, right? I'm not going to pop by your cubicle or pop by your office anymore. Now all of a sudden we're having Zoom meetings. And in a way it became a little bit distant, but at the same time in some ways more personal, because we're now seeing each other's living room, or maybe if you have a desk set up in the bedroom, right? And we're seeing each other's decor, and all of a sudden there's an interesting dynamic that happens there. And again, I'm saying too much because I'm getting ahead of myself, but there's just some really fascinating things that happen as a result of that shift. And in a way, it kind of pulled us away from the more traditional approach and gave us insights into the human interaction view. And then the last perspective, and again, I'm really hitting on this briefly, is the critical perspective. This is heavily influenced by Marxist theory. Whenever you hear the term critical, opposed to like critical thinking or being critical, but I mean within organizations or even within politics, things like that, critical is related to Marxist theory. And so the idea there is organizations are designed to oppress or empower. And critical theory, when it comes to OrgComm, I'll be transparent. I'm not a huge fan of critical theory with organizations and OrgComm. It does have some value because it helps shine light on problems. So, labor unions in the early 20th century, that perspective of, hey, these workers were being oppressed. They were unsafe working conditions. We needed to do something about that. Or even shining the light. Critical theory is going to help shine the light on, sweatshops in developing nations and exploiting workers in those kind of situations. So in some ways, there's some real value there. My problem with critical theory is, it's kind of in the name. Critical theory tends to be very, very negative. And I mean from this standpoint, anything an organization does, a true critical theorist immediately points their finger at it and says, well, you're just doing that to oppress the worker and make the upper echelons wealthier and empower them. So that's what I mean. Organizations are designed to oppress and empower. So an organization may say, hey, we're going to go to a completely casual dress code, right? Every day it's dress for your day, it's casual. And I might look at that and go, well, look at that. That's great. They're being considerate of their employees. A critical theorist is going to look at that and go, well, they're just doing that to try and exploit their workers to get more work out of them so that they make more money. And so I'm being a little bit harsh on that, but I'm not too. I mean, you read the critical literature, and that's kind of what it is. So again, it's a little bit of a struggle for me because I tend to be kind of a positive guy, and I want to give people the benefit of the doubt. And sometimes critical theory is just that, critical. And so it kind of is a little bit negative, and it's like, is there anything positive going on at all? So again, those are the three perspectives that a person's going to have when they approach this concept of organizational communication. And how it will influence them will be how they look at it, and or like if you're a consultant or even within the organization, how are you going to try and improve things, right? So a traditional approach is going to be that classical management. It's kind of a machine. I can take a part out, look at it, tweak with the part, put it back in, and everything goes off running. Interpretive approach is the human interaction. So I'm going to be talking with people and what's the climate and what's the culture and things like that. And if you haven't guessed it, I'm much more of an interpretive person myself. I see some value in traditional and some value in critical from time to time, but overall, I'm an interpretive person. I'm about those human relationships and how do those constitute and create the organization. And then the critical person is going to look at that and say, often a critical person's approach is we got to blow the whole system up, right? Because right now it's designed in a negative way, so we need to totally restructure the system as a whole and create a whole new organization to a certain extent. So those are going to be your three perspectives with OrgComm. and hopefully those will be helpful. Now, you're going to dig more into the interpretive approach as you read the article by Carl Weick and do a case study analysis of that. The next lecture, I decided not to lecture this because I found a brief online lecture about strategic ambiguity. And the professor that does the lecture, I felt like he did it in a much more effective way than I could do, and it's pretty brief. So hopefully you'll enjoy that lecture on strategic ambiguity. And then this will conclude the lectures for Module 3. And you've got the case study to read. It's a 2-week module. And then I'll see you back in Module 4.